Well, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having me here. Let me begin with a little story that seems apt to our present discontents. Let me take you back to the Palace of Westminster. The year is 1945, and the new Prime Minister is Clement Attlee from the Labour Party. And one day, he's relieving himself in the gents at the House of Commons. The door opens, and it's the leader of the opposition, Sir Winston Churchill. He spies the Prime Minister at the urinal, and he walks right down purposefully to the farthest end. Clement Attlee looks over his shoulder. He says, "Oh, feeling a bit standoffish today, are we, Winston?" And Churchill, majestically unbuttoning his fly, replies, "No, but whenever you see anything big, Clement, you nationalize it." Now, it may be scant comfort to tell you that things are worse abroad than they are here. Gordon Brown, the reason I tell that story, Gordon Brown has now spent a higher percentage of Britain's national wealth on nationalisation than Clement Attlee did during the post-war seizures of the main industries. And to fund it, he has borrowed more than Winston Churchill borrowed to win the Second World War with the rather obvious difference that we haven't just been fighting the Second World War, we've rather had a government that's been busily engaged in handing away the freedoms that our fathers fought for. Things are worse in other places, even than here. Your president, I'm told, is going to borrow more than all of his 43 predecessors from George Washington to George Bush. Our Prime Minister is going to borrow more in the next 2 years than was borrowed by every single government since the national debt was introduced in my country in 1693. Do you know what? I'm not here to depress you. I'm going to try and cheer this up a bit, because I was very affected when Art Laffer said yesterday that it's important to end on a note of warmth, of optimism. You know, that it's important to stress that what's done can be undone. And what an honour it is, if I may say so, to be speaking from the same stage that Professor Laffer spoke from. And what an honour, too, to be speaking from the same stage that Newt Gingrich will be speaking from, because he proved in practical terms the point that Art Laffer made in general terms. He showed that what's done can be undone. He showed that it's possible to end 40 years of one-party rule and indeed to introduce voters to the rather novel idea that legislators can sometimes keep their promises. So I'm not here to depress you. I'm here to look for solutions to our discontents. And you know what? I think those solutions are to be found in this room, in this organization, in the American Legislative Exchange Council. I first came to an ALEC meeting when I was a newly elected MEP nearly 10 years ago. And your mission statement, in a way, has guided my actions ever since. The whole of my political career in the United Kingdom could be said to be an attempt to apply the ALEC mission statement to the domestic conditions of my native country. Let me just reread. You've heard it a million times, but it's always worth doing these things. They can become worn through familiarity. Let's just read again the mission statement. The mission of the American Legislative Exchange Council is to advance the Jeffersonian principles of free markets, limited government, federalism, and individual liberty among America's state legislators. Just think for a second about what that means. Jeffersonian principles. What do we mean by Jeffersonian principles? We mean that the concentration of power leads to malfeasance and corruption and tyranny. We mean that jurisdiction should be dispersed. We mean that decisions should be taken as closely as possible to the people that they affect. And we mean that decision makers should be directly elected, wherever practicable. Let me quote the great man himself. This, in a way, sounds so obvious, but think about it. He defined it in the draft Kentucky resolutions. He said, to take from the states all the powers of self-government and transfer them to a general and consolidated government is not for the peace, happiness, or prosperity of these states. Right. How obvious is that? And yet, from the simple statement of those foundational precepts has grown up a unique system of democracy in your country, the like of which cannot be found anywhere else on earth. Now look, it's human nature to take for granted what is familiar to us. We can become blasé. But it was as a result of the application of those Jeffersonian principles that you have this system based on open primaries, based on the direct election of public officials from the school board to the sheriff, based on competing tax jurisdictions, based on something that has just filled me with such enthusiasm over the last couple of days listening to you, which is this wonderful pluralism and diversity and variety that exists among the 50 state jurisdictions. As I say, you can take these things for granted, but how precious it is to have this capacity to innovate and to trial new ideas, to pilot new schemes, to copy what's working elsewhere. That has been the greatest guarantor of American freedom and prosperity. To see how unusual your system is, let's consider what happened during these recent bailouts and stimulus packages. Now, my guess is that probably most of you in this room would not have been enthusiastic supporters of the President's recent stimulus package. I wouldn't have been either. But you know what? At least the decision was taken ultimately by your elected representatives. Every penny, every dot and comma in that bill was haggled over by elected politicians who knew that within a year or two they would have to go back to their constituents, who are also their taxpayers, and explain how they voted. Contrast that to what happened in the rest of the world. In Europe, too, we had bailout and stimulus packages, but they were decreed by the executives without any involvement from the legislatures, whatever. Our Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, announced a much bigger sum per capita, much higher bailout in relative terms than President Obama did here. And he did so without so much as summoning Parliament, which at the time was in recess. Not only was there no vote, there wasn't even a debate. And there was I believing that we had come through a civil war in my country to establish the principle that only the House of Commons might raise revenue through legal taxation. To see how different the American system is, look at the alternative. Look at the way in which the European Union organizes its affairs. Here in the room in front of me are legislators from dispersed jurisdictions coming up with new laws, which then go into the free marketplace of ideas and succeed or fail on the basis of their record. Do you know, the only organization in the European Union that can initiate legislation is the European Commission, who nobody votes for. More than 4 out of every 5 laws in Europe now come from Brussels, generated by a body of 27 appointed bureaucrats who are immune to public opinion, invulnerable to the ballot box. And so deep is their contempt for democracy, their disdain for the expression of popular will, that when people vote no, they simply swat the result aside. 3 times now they've attempted to impose a European constitution, and 3 times it's been rejected at the ballot box by 54% of French voters, by 62% of Dutch voters, most recently by 53% of Irish voters. And what has been the result in Brussels? How have they responded? They have simply carried on with implementation as if those referendum results hadn't happened. All of the clauses and articles of the European Constitution are being ratified anyway. I'm reminded of that eerie poem by Bertolt Brecht where he writes, "Wouldn't it therefore be easier to dissolve the people and elect another in their place?"